Welcome to Transcendent Psychotherapist. There's no better thing to do at the end of a year and the beginning of a new year than to think about death. So this episode is called Embracing Mortality, and I'm just going to be thinking through psychologically, philosophically, etc., how we can use our aging and our what we call mortality salience, our sense of approaching death more and more, as something really useful to make us more alive. 3 facts. Death exerts a powerful yet unseen grip on our minds. Second fact, death awareness is the key to waking up in life. And the third thing I want to really iterate here is that death makes life worth living, or even more worth living, depending on whether you believe there's an afterlife or not. I think either way, it's important. And from the outset, let me say that for the purposes of this episode, I'm neither ruling in or out the existence of an afterlife, okay? Personally, I believe there is a state of consciousness beyond death. See my other video called After, which is about the kind of scientific evidence around near-death experiences, particularly looks at the book called After by Dr. Bruce Grayson, gathering over 40 years worth of evidence of these phenomena. But what I have to say is relevant whatever you believe. And I would suggest that reflecting on death as an endpoint of life as we know it can be a very useful exercise, whether there's something else beyond it or not. In modern life, death is kept carefully hidden from view. In past times, it was more obvious. If you reached the age of 10 without losing siblings or a parent, you were the exception. And if you lived beyond childhood, you did well. In the 1840s, around 15% of babies died before their first birthday, compared to just 0.4%. That's the ONS here in Britain statistics at 2011. In the past, family members died at home, whereas now the elderly are increasingly siphoned off into nursing homes, and palliative care is tucked away out of sight into hospitals and hospices. The cult of perpetual youth means that there's a preference for those with a youthful appearance appearing in the media, and airbrushing out of those who more obviously show signs of mortality. It's increasingly rare for funerals to have open caskets, and we prefer celebrations of life in place of rites of mourning and grief. And that's, not for me to judge these things, and I quite understand why we might prefer them. But the effect is that death is covered over. The truth, if you like, is concealed from view. In the last several decades, a great deal of research, terror management theory, has shown that if you expose people to subtle unconscious reminders of death, it affects their behavior unconsciously. People fall back more strongly on their religious or cultural worldviews and oppose others' worldviews more strongly. They become more prone to negative emotion and more approving of hostile actions towards outsider groups. Clearly, death reminders affect us whether we realize it or not. There's an automatic response of the psyche to keep close to others of your type and tribe for safety, and to offset anxiety by strengthening any belief that can dissolve the threat of annihilation, whether the belief is true or not, by the way. We're certainly not all affected by unconscious reminders of death in the same way, but we are all affected. And when we're affected by things unconsciously, they have a kind of power over us. They act like invisible strings pulling on a puppet. So becoming aware of death opens the possibility of gaining back freedom over our behavior. Irvin Yalom, a prominent existential psychotherapist, writes this: death, however, does itch. It itches all the time. It's always with us, scratching at some inner door, mirroring softly, barely audibly, just under the membranes of consciousness, hidden in disguise, leaking out in a variety of symptoms. It's the wellspring of many of our worries, stresses, and conflicts. If he's right, it's not simply that death anxiety bothers us unawares, but that it's a hidden motive force in many aspects of our lives, not just in what we do, but in what we avoid. In our dream life, death anxiety is revealed in symbolic form. nightmares in which one's life is under threat, and in waking life it might be displaced by a desire to compensate by ignoring death and celebrating life, especially in hedonistic excess. We remember the kind of "let us eat, drink and be merry" bit of the famous quote, but drop the "for tomorrow we die" part from consciousness. For others, it may manifest in the denial of aging, a wish to avoid celebrating a milestone birthday, or a tendency to live vicariously through our children or grandchildren. It may manifest itself in a rush to cram as much as we can into life, only to leave us harried and unable to enjoy it. I'm sure we're not all affected in the same way, and that there are some who are bothered very little by their death, consciously or unconsciously, but for a great many of us, it's there in the shadows. Before we move on to think about how we might consciously use the awareness of our mortality, I want to explore the idea that despite our anxiety over death, most of us, if we really thought about it, could be grateful for our mortality. Let's consider this idea then that death might be a kind of mercy. I suspect that we're on the cusp of being able to extend life by decades, if not centuries. With genetic engineering progressing apace and our ability to manipulate stem cells, it's only a matter of time before we can engineer our bodies to last for very long periods indeed, and probably have replacement body parts kept in storage for constant replacement as parts wear out. Imagine what it would be like if your life could be extended by 200, 300, 400 years, likely much longer. What would the impact be on you psychologically? Here are some suggestions. You'd see the world constantly changing before you're imagining. You'd have to adapt endlessly. Your intimate relationships would have to endure for hundreds of years, or more likely, you'd experience multiple divorces and separations and having to start again. How much loss and change could we take? And how would it change us? You would need to work for centuries, maybe returning to work after long sabbatical retirements in which you'd retrain for new roles. There'd be a novelty to that, sure, but also a heavy burden of never reaching a time when you could finally hang up your tools and rest. There would be long stretches of time and demand upon us with no clear end in sight, centuries of Monday mornings. How would our memories cope? Reminiscing over hundreds of years of lifetime, who would we be? How would we make sense of a life story that long if it's having to start over with new relationships and new work over so long a period of time? What would happen to you morally? Would you just keep accumulating wealth? Would you care for others, or increasingly want to protect your very long-term future security? What would happen to new generations as the super-aged gain in wealth and power? Would we stop having or needing children? We'd likely have to make a choice about whether to keep living or not, because as technology kept improving, the ability to keep extending life would be increasingly perfected. So how would we cope with having to choose eternity or choose to cease living? I mean, eternity, whatever your maybe spiritual or religious beliefs, eternity in this life, in this world as it is, I think most people would agree would become a burden after a time. If living forever became possible, would we be able to cope with the burden of existence? This little thought experiment, I think, shows that immortality is a heavy weight to bear. So life, I think, would become increasingly so stretched out that it would lose its savour. If existence, either in this form or an afterlife, were not to become some kind of hell, it would need to be not merely longer in quantity, but constantly improving and changing in quality. And it would require us having a very different psychological makeup. Our current psychological makeup that we're kind of evolved for living this kind of life wouldn't be able to cope with it. People would be crying out for the mercy of death after not so very long. But the finitude of life doesn't subtract from its value, but rather adds to it. It feels far from the case when we lose someone close or if someone dies prematurely, but in truth, the finitude of life is what makes it so precious. We value gold and platinum more than iron ore because it's a rarer metal in shorter supply. So it is with life. Its brevity and precariousness make it valuable. And that will lead inevitably to the wish that it will not be taken from us. There's the catch-22. It's the fact that it will be taken from us that makes us value it and wish to keep it. And I think this perspective doesn't remove the anxiety and sadness that comes up from being mortal, but it does open us up to a greater privilege, to appreciate what we have, to wake up to what we have, and to live a life worth living. Awareness of life's finitude might then just jolt us not so much into morbid fear, but into an appreciative engagement with the goods that we have and the good that we have the power to do. Different religions and philosophies have urged people to keep their mortality consciously front and center in their thoughts, not in order to make life miserable, but to enhance it and to force themselves into entering properly into the task of living well. Irvin Yalom, I mentioned earlier in his book Staring at the Sun, reflects on the change that occurs in Ebenezer Scrooge as the ghost of Christmas future drags him to his gravestone etched with his name. Scrooge undergoes a transformation, not because he's suddenly, filled with Yuletide spirit, nor because of his conscience, but because he sees that what he is in the bigger scheme of life and the bigger scheme of things beyond this own particular life. He's jolted into change. Death puts his life into perspective, kind of like a shock therapy. And without conscious reflection on the finitude and brevity of his days, he would have remained asleep in the night. One of the common themes for people as they consider their mortality is not so much the fear of life's ending, but the fear that somehow life will have passed them by. That, aside from his miserliness, was Scrooge's problem. He was living life as if he just could keep on going as it had been, and yet he was a kind of dead man walking. Life was passing him by, and he wasn't truly alive, but living out an ever-deadening trajectory of withdrawal from the things that make life worthwhile: love, joy, relationships, generosity. Were he a client, for example, in my practice room, I'd be very curious about the way his early relationships led him to fall back on himself alone, to feel secure. Sometimes, however, our present life is so deeply fossilized by the layers of experience that have built up that the ghosts of Christmas past and present are insufficient to free us, and only the shock administered by the dawning of the future can jolt us into life. So here's a thought experiment you might wish to try. The ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas future approaches and carries you forward 10, 20, 30 years hence, and silently points its finger at your gravestone. You see your name on it, the wind blows in the surrounding trees, and you see the date of your birth and the date of your death 1 year prior. The ghost then takes you off and shows you your relatives getting on with their days, the places you've worked in, continuing on as usual, the house where you last lived. He then shows you your dreams, the things you'd promised yourself and others, but not done. And you sit there, the grass gently swaying, the birds singing, looking at your name. There's nothing more that can change, nothing that can be done. It is done. You're finally transported back to the present, and you begin to reflect. What do you feel? What do you think? What needs to change? Do you need to spend a bit longer thinking this through? Nietzsche once wrote, "Consummate your life." The unconsummated marriage is one that has not achieved a proper mating of potential with actuality. It's a marriage in which the partners have not made it real. And it's easy to put life off and constantly live a life that's all about getting ready for the real thing that we'll imagine will start several years hence. But this is it. This is the real thing. And you won't get this back. And that was what Scrooge addressed, having been faced with his own mortality. He stopped avoiding life and engaged with it, throwing himself into it. And it's a real challenge, especially for the more reflective and the more analytical among us. But live in such a way, Nietzsche said, that you're not obliged to live the same life repeatedly. Sorry, Nietzsche said that were you obliged to live the same life repeatedly, you would still not regret it. So live life, as if you'd be happy to live it all over again. Keep mortality in front of you, the possible number of Christmases to come, summers to enjoy, weekends with those you love. Make love to your life. Another fear people have is the fear of transience. I kind of mentioned that in a way a minute ago, that the world will continue oblivious to our ending. That will happen. I was walking once with my son through an old English churchyard in some beautiful countryside, and we looked with interest at the tombstones. Some names were still clear, some had crumbled beyond legibility. Some lifespans were long, others short. And there was very little information on these people's lives, but a clear desire to be remembered, to have their names permanently etched and not forgotten. In his work with clients fearful of being forgotten, Irvin Yalom reminds them that all lives make ripples. We continue in some way into the future, genetically through our children and through the influence we make on people. And that's a pleasant thought, that in fact we can be someone whose life will have a positive reach beyond our own. Maybe that's why I do what I do here. Maybe that's why I'm a therapist. We're transient. The ripples will fade, and yet at some level, what we've done will go on resonating in the pool of human experience. We can do our part alongside others to leave something life-enhancing. And I certainly think that can ease the sense that our death makes life pointless, when we consider that, on the contrary, our lives have power for good or ill on others. Even Scrooge could discover this late on in life and leave powerful, positive ripples that would resonate in the lives of others and thereby enriching them. This now pushes us towards a spiritual question of sorts. What should our lives be about? Time is short. What's the best thing or set of things we should pursue? And it's not for me to answer that for you, but I'll provide you with some pointers for consideration. The point is this: given the shortness of the time, the ease with which it's wasted, and the multitude of things that clamour for our attention, we need to consider a personal framework of values to guide us through making the most of life. And here's just a few to consider. What's the relationship you want to have between yourself and others? What's going to be most important as well? What premium will you place on fulfilling your needs compared to meeting the needs of others? And there's two equal and opposite dangers here. First, that we live in such a self-focused way that we lose connection and empathy and compassion. Research showing that being compassionate and reasonably altruistic is better for our health and well-being, as well as being good for others. But the second danger is, we could be so other-pleasing that we let go of our own dreams and disavow aspects of our interests and personality. That's a path to resentment and regret. The key question to ask here might be, is my care for others motivated by inner compassion, or does it come down to guilt? Resolving the issue of how you manage personal needs and others' demands is important, and it's helpful to have a thought out personal philosophy on it. Next area I think it's worth considering is what I call now versus then. So I've done self versus other. This is now versus then. If we've dealt with much of our past, we're left pulled in two main directions, to the present moment or the future. And we've already seen the danger in being so focused on achieving the next thing that we never really live in the moment, life constantly being deferred. The opposite danger is to be so immersed in the present that we make little provision for the future. Each present moment we have is shaped by a past that was once our future. We may have sacrificed time or money so that we could be doing the things that we can do now, which otherwise we'd not been able to do. But there's a balance to be struck. You can live so much with the future and be so sort of, Scrooge was probably doing that, investing everything he had just for that rainy day, but never enjoying the now. I think a lot of people do that and then get to the end of their days and they've saved up for something they've never spent it on, if you like. The other area to think about is pleasure versus meaning. Okay, so the other area of values we need to consider is the weight we give to living for pleasure or avoiding suffering, compared to the weight we give to living for what's meaningful and important. And those two things are often hard to reconcile. Things that give us present moment hits of pleasure and excitement tend to fade fairly rapidly, and things that tap into deeper values and feel meaningful but aren't about an instant feel-good factor tend to create a longer lasting slow burn of well-being. People that do both are the happiest, according to the research. So the question you need to ask yourself is, where will you get your feel-good times, and how will you also do what's meaningful? How will you balance both those things? Okay, well, thank you for listening. I've given you lots of food for thought there. Please do leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. Please do subscribe and share, and put a like there if you found any of this useful.